On June 4th, 1943, the small town of Mexia, Texas, population just over 7,000 people, did something it had never done before. The entire community walked out to Railroad Street, lined up along the sidewalks, and stood there in the summer heat waiting for a train. Not a train carrying supplies, not a train carrying soldiers heading off to war. They were waiting for the enemy. When the locomotive finally pulled in and the passenger coaches ground to a stop, 1,850 men in the faded khaki uniforms of the German Afrika Korps stepped onto the platform. These were veterans of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's legendary Desert Army. Men who had pushed the British all the way back to the Egyptian border. Men who had fought across the sands of Libya and Tunisia for 2 years under the most punishing conditions imaginable. Men who had been told and firmly believed that the United States of America was a soft, mongrel nation that would never survive a real war. As they marched down Railroad Street under armed guard, something unexpected happened. A pencil trembled in the hand of one of those prisoners, a man later identified in his diary only as a lower-ranking infantryman from the 15th Panzer Division, and he began writing. He would keep writing through his entire captivity. What he recorded over the next 2.5 years was not a war diary. It was something far more extraordinary. It was the documented step-by-step collapse of everything he'd ever been taught to believe. This is that story. To understand the scale of what was about to happen to these men, you first have to understand who they were and what they had been told before they ever set foot in America. The Afrika Korps was not an ordinary military force. It was the pride of the Wehrmacht. Its men had won stunning victories against numerically superior Allied forces for 2 years. They were experienced, battle-hardened, and deeply indoctrinated in the ideology of National Socialism. Nazi propaganda had painted a very specific picture of the United States for them. America was racially inferior, internally divided, economically rotten beneath the surface, and fundamentally incapable of fighting a long war. Its citizens were soft consumers, not warriors. Its democracy was a system of weakness. When Germany eventually turned its full attention westward, the propaganda promised America would crumble. Those beliefs went into the processing centers at Oran and Tunis after the May 13, 1943 surrender, when General Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel's replacement, formally capitulated along with the last remnants of Axis resistance in North Africa. Roughly 275,000 German and Italian soldiers walked into Allied custody in the span of a few days. It was one of the largest mass surrenders of the entire war, and it immediately created a logistical problem of staggering proportions. Britain was exhausted and could not absorb that many prisoners. The North African coast was too close to active fighting, and so the decision was made to ship the bulk of the German prisoners to the United States. Liberty ships that had been carrying supplies and equipment from American ports to the war zones in Africa were loaded for the return journey with a very different kind of cargo. As many as 30,000 German prisoners per month began crossing the Atlantic to ports in New York, New Jersey, and Virginia. And the psychological unraveling began the moment they boarded those ships. Reinhold Pabel, a Wehrmacht infantryman who crossed the Atlantic in January 1944, captured the moment perfectly in a memoir he wrote years later. He had spent most of his military service riding in boxcars, the standard transportation for German troops. 40 men to a freight wagon sitting on the floor with their gear, cold, cramped, and smelling of livestock. When he and his fellow prisoners were directed onto the decks of the Empress of Scotland, and then guided to actual passenger cabins with berths and corridor lighting, he stood in the doorway for a long moment, unable to process what he was seeing. He wrote that most of the men simply didn't know what to do with themselves. They sat on the edges of their bunks and stared at the walls. The food served in the ship's mess, real bread, meat, vegetables, and coffee with actual sugar, was treated with deep suspicion at first. The assumption was that it was a staged display, a one-time performance to impress the prisoners before the reality of captivity set in. It never did set in. The food stayed the same, the bunk stayed comfortable, the lights stayed on. Kurt Zimmermann, a corporal from the 90th Light Division who kept detailed letters that survived through the post-war years, noted something during the crossing that lodged permanently in his memory. Each day at sea, American sailors disposed of food waste in quantities that he could not reconcile with anything he knew about wartime Germany. He watched them throw out half-eaten loaves of bread. He watched them pour gallons of milk down a drain because it had been sitting too long. He watched them scrape entire plates of food into disposal bins without a second glance. He wrote that they did this not to mock the prisoners, not as any kind of deliberate statement, but out of pure, unthinking habit. The waste was so automatic, so completely unremarkable to the men performing it, that it was somehow more devastating than contempt would have been. Contempt would have implied awareness. This was something else. This was the behavior of people who simply had too much to ever think about it. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Steuben, whose Prussian family had served in the German military going back generations, was on a different ship during the summer crossings of 1943. As his vessel approached the American coastline, he found himself standing at the rail watching the bridge crew work their equipment. He noticed the radar antenna rotating steadily above the navigation room. In Germany and across the Axis powers, radar was classified technology carefully guarded, deployed only on warships and the most critical installations. Von Steuben had known about it, had known the British and Germans both used it, but had always understood it as a scarce and precious system. Here it was mounted on a cargo vessel, a merchant ship carrying prisoners of war, standard equipment. He later wrote in his memoirs that it was in that moment, watching that ordinary antenna spin against the grey Atlantic sky, that he first genuinely suspected Germany had already lost the war. August 2nd, 1943. The ships carrying the first major waves of Afrika Korps prisoners docked at the naval base in Norfolk, Virginia. What the prisoners saw when they walked off the gangways shattered the last of their most comfortable assumptions. Norfolk's naval installation covered 4,300 acres of waterfront. Its docks stretched for miles in both directions, and on the morning the German prisoners arrived, dozens of cargo vessels were simultaneously loading and unloading all along the quays. The cranes moved continuously, lifting massive cargo containers with the smooth, unhurried precision of machinery that had been doing this work for years. A soldier from the Ruhr industrial region, himself a factory worker before his conscription, stood at the edge of the dock and counted 47 cargo ships within his line of sight. He noted in his diary that each crane did in a single lift what would have required 12 men, 2 horses, and a block and tackle system in Germany. The machines moved without coal smoke, without the straining, grinding effort he associated with heavy industrial work. They moved on electricity cleanly and quietly, as though the loads were nothing. The column of prisoners was then marched awaiting trains. This is where many of the first accounts converge on a single, almost comic detail. The prisoners had expected freight wagons, the 40 men per car arrangements that German soldiers knew from their own army's transport system. What they found instead were Pullman passenger coaches, the standard long-distance American railway carriages of the era, with upholstered seats, large windows, dining cars with white tablecloths, and sleeping berths. One account preserved in the records at the Smithsonian describes an American sergeant apologizing to a group of German officers that the air conditioning in their particular car wasn't functioning properly. It was August in Virginia. The prisoners had never been in an air-conditioned rail car in their lives. The idea that they were receiving an apology for its temporary absence struck several of them as so surreal that they wrote about it independently. The 3-day train journey from the Virginia coast to the camps of Texas and Oklahoma would do more to undermine Nazi ideology than any formal propaganda program the Allied governments could have devised. And it did it entirely accidentally, simply by passing through the normal American landscape at normal American speed. The first thing that struck every prisoner who left an account was the light. Germany had enforced total blackout conditions since 1940, not just in the cities, not just near military installations, everywhere. Even rural farmhouses were required to cover every window after dark. The entire country had been in darkness for 3 years, and now the trains rolled through the American night, and every small town they passed was lit up as though there were no war anywhere in the world. Martinsville, Virginia, Danville, Greensboro, North Carolina. Communities that in Germany would have rated perhaps a single gas lamp on the main street were displaying illuminated shop windows, electric signs in 2 and 3 colours, houses with lights burning in every room. A soldier whose father was a Nazi party block organiser in Hamburg wrote in a letter, discovered 40 years later in a private archive, that when the first lit-up town appeared outside his window, he called the guard over and told him flatly that he was looking at a stage display. The guard, he wrote, just shrugged and said they could check every town they passed. Then he sat down and went back to reading his magazine. Town after town appeared and disappeared through the night. None of them went dark. Feldwebel Hinrich Müller, an electrical engineer from Siemens before his conscription, began calculating in his head. He estimated the power consumption of a single rail yard they stopped at for water. He worked the numbers and arrived at a figure that represented more electrical output in 1 hour than his entire district in Berlin used in a day. He wrote that he checked his arithmetic twice. The answer was the same both times. He described the waste as magnificent in the literal sense, meaning something that produces awe. Empty rooms with lights burning, fans running in unoccupied spaces, an entire civilization operating in the assumption that power was simply always there and always would be. As the trains crossed into Tennessee and Kentucky, the prisoners began passing factories. Not the kind of factory Germany had, carefully sited, individually significant, each one known by name to anyone involved in planning or economics. These factories came one after another, each larger than the last, all of them running night shifts with their windows blazing. The aluminum company of America's plant along the Tennessee River stretched for 3 miles. Its electric furnaces consumed roughly 175,000 kilowatts of power. To put that in a frame the German prisoners could have understood, it consumed more electricity than the entire city of Munich. A Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia who was on one of the trains, pressed his face against the window as they passed the Ford facility outside Detroit that was visible from the track. He counted the visible B-24 Liberator bombers in various stages of assembly. He counted 17. German military briefings had told him that American aircraft were hastily constructed and prone to failure. He wrote later that he stood at that window and understood with absolute clarity that he had been lied to. Near Louisville, the train slowed while passing a complex of synthetic rubber plants that had been built on what had been empty farmland just 18 months earlier. 4 massive facilities, each employing thousands of workers, producing a combined output that comfortably exceeded 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber per year. Germany had invented the synthetic rubber process. Germany, with all the resources of occupied Europe at its disposal, had never managed to produce more than 120,000 tons in its best year. A chemist from IG Farben who was among the prisoners recognized the distillation columns and catalytic crackers from the train window. He later told American interviewers that he'd counted the facilities and done the mental math on their combined capacity during the journey. He said that by the time the train reached Tennessee, he stopped trying to fit what he was seeing into the framework of what he'd believed about American industrial capacity, because the framework simply couldn't hold it. In St. Louis, the tracks crossed the Mississippi River on the Eads Bridge, and down below an unbroken procession of barges moved through the channel carrying grain. The grain elevators stretched along both banks of the river, massive concrete structures rising above the waterline, each one holding enough wheat to feed a major German city for months. A Bavarian farmer's son named Karl Schmidt, who'd grown up around agriculture and understood grain yields, wrote in his diary that the Americans transported food the way his army transported ammunition, in quantities so large that the concept of running short had ceased to be real to them. He watched a crane operator loading one of the barges pause to eat a sandwich. The sandwich, he noted, contained more meat than his weekly ration in North Africa. In Kansas City, the train stopped near one of the great stockyards where tens of thousands of cattle moved through the processing system. The smell of the meatpacking plants reached the train cars from miles out. The men who had subsisted on 200 grams of meat per week in the desert, when they were lucky, could smell this. A soldier who gave his account to historians only as Paul F. wrote later, "They ate meat the way we wished we could eat bread." Then, remarkably, an American guard bought a bag of hamburgers from a stand near the station. He bought them for the prisoners without being asked, without ceremony, without making anything of it. 20 sandwiches, meat and cheese and vegetables on white bread, bought for 15 cents each and distributed without comment. Paul F. wrote that no one spoke while they ate, not because the food was so extraordinary, though it was, but because everyone had simultaneously understood that this was not a performance. This was not staged for their benefit. This was just what these people ate, every day, without thinking about it. The arrival at the camps themselves delivered the next level of shock, and this time it was not industrial power but ordinary domestic comfort that did the damage. Camp Hearn in Texas, typical of the larger facilities, had been built in just 4 months on a site that had been empty pasture. It housed between 3,000 and 5,000 prisoners in wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heat. The buildings were constructed with more lumber than most of the small German towns the prisoners came from, contained in all their structures combined. Each building was larger than anything most of the men had lived in as civilians. The camp hospital, which Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, was assigned to assist in, was better equipped than most German civilian hospitals he'd worked in before the war. X-ray machines, proper surgical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies that had been unavailable in Germany since 1941, and penicillin. Dr. Bauer later testified in a post-war interview that seeing penicillin used routinely on prisoners with minor infections was one of the most disorienting experiences of his captivity. German soldiers had been dying for want of basic sulfur drugs. Here the Americans were dispensing their most advanced antibiotic medicine on enemy prisoners with infected cuts. He said he stood in the dispensary the first day and felt physically ill, not from any illness himself, but from the sudden, enormous weight of understanding exactly what had been withheld from Germany's own fighting men, while an enemy power used the same medicine as a routine courtesy. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a hotel chef from Munich before the war, was assigned to kitchen duties and discovered a facility capable of preparing meals for 5,000 men, equipped with walk-in refrigerators, electric mixing machines, gas ranges, and automated dishwashers. The daily ration issued to prisoners included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread. Krebs wrote in his diary that on his first day in the kitchen he threw away more perfectly edible food than his family in Munich had seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, surplus. American military regulations required that 10% more food be prepared than needed to ensure that every prisoner received a full ration. The surplus was discarded as a matter of procedure. He wrote that he wept while he threw the bread away, but he could not have told anyone exactly why. It was not grief for anything specific. It was something more like the sudden total understanding of how enormous the distance was between what Germany had and what America had, and how long ago that outcome had actually been decided. By September 1943, a labor shortage in American agriculture had become acute enough that the government began employing German prisoners as farm workers. This decision, made entirely out of economic necessity, proved to be one of the most psychologically consequential things anyone could have done with these men. Groups of prisoners were transported each morning by truck to work sites across the American heartland, traveling through the countryside without restrictions on what they could see. No blindfolds, no covered windows, they saw everything. Herbert Lang, assigned to cotton work outside Houston, watched a single mechanical cotton gin process more raw cotton in 1 hour than his entire home village could have handled in a month, using the manual methods he'd grown up with. The gin was powered by electricity from the Colorado River Authority, part of a rural electrification program that by 1943 had brought power to 90% of Texas farms. The farmer who owned it was nobody of any social distinction, Lang noted. Not a wealthy man, not a party member, not a member of any privileged class. Just a farmer, operating on his own land, with electricity and running water and a truck and a car and a tractor. His workers ate lunches from boxes that contained more food than German industrial labourers received in a full week. Lang wrote that he looked at the scene around him and understood for the first time that what he was seeing was not the exceptional. This was the ordinary. In Nebraska, other groups of prisoners worked in sugar beet fields and watched combine harvesters move across plains so flat and so vast that the horizon seemed to go on without limit. A single combine, they learned, could do the work of 100 men in a day. The fields were larger than entire German counties. Farmers talked casually of wheat yields per acre that would have been considered fantasy in Germany. A 16-year-old boy on one of the Nebraska farms drove a tractor that Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann estimated was worth more than everything his own father had earned in his lifetime. When Hoffmann mentioned this, the boy laughed and said it wasn't even a particularly good tractor. His father was saving up for a new John Deere model. Hoffmann wrote that he spent the rest of that day's work trying to understand what kind of country he was living in, where a farmer's son could say something like that and mean it literally and think nothing of it. At a Campbell's soup factory in New Jersey, prisoners assigned to labor duties that did not violate the Geneva Convention's prohibitions on war work watched production lines process more tomatoes in a single day than most German food processing factories handled in a month. The facility was running on a skeleton crew of women and elderly men, most of the young workers having been absorbed into the military or direct war production. Yet output exceeded the plant's peacetime levels. A German soldier who had worked in a food processing factory in Frankfurt before the war, Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, documented what he saw in careful detail. Electric conveyor belts moved product continuously without supervision. Automatic filling machines operated at speeds no human hands could match. Steam cookers processed hundreds of cans simultaneously. One elderly woman, he wrote, monitored a control panel that managed what would have required 50 workers in Germany. She did this while listening to a radio and drinking coffee. He sat down next to his workstation and stared at the floor for a long time after writing that passage. Near Detroit, prisoners unloading coal at a power station had views across the water of the River Rouge complex, Ford Motor Company's integrated manufacturing facility. It employed over 100,000 workers producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and armored vehicles. Its parking lots were visible from across the river, thousands of cars belonging to workers. Obergefreiter Franz Kellner wrote that an American guard had told him many of the workers owned 2 cars, one for the commute to the plant and one for family use. He wrote that he had thought the guard was mocking them. Then he looked at the parking lots again and the thought dissolved. By the winter of 1943, American intelligence officers monitoring the prisoner camps had begun noticing something they called ideological collapse syndrome in their internal reports. The Special Projects Division, which ran the Army's covert re-education program under the Provost Marshal General's office, documented a steady and accelerating increase in prisoners requesting access to American newspapers, books, and educational materials. The program itself had been designed to carefully introduce democratic values through what it called intellectual diversion, films, classes, and publications that presented the positive aspects of American life without appearing to be propaganda. What the program's architects had not fully anticipated was that by late 1943, the program was almost beside the point. The prisoners were already educating themselves. Major Paul Newland, one of the intelligence officers assigned to monitor prisoner attitudes, reported in December 1943 that the most fanatical Nazis in the camps had gone quiet. Not converted. Not won over by arguments, just quiet. They still maintained their loyalty to Germany and to the idea of Germany. But they had stopped talking about victory. They had seen too much in the preceding months, and what they had seen could not be unseen. The men who argued most loudly in the camps were now the ones trying to explain what they had witnessed, trying to reconcile the America they had encountered with the America they had been told existed, and finding they could not do it. The camp newspapers that prisoners produced themselves, and which American authorities permitted and monitored closely as a measure of prisoner attitudes, began to shift in tone. Der Ruf, a journal published at one of the larger camps, which had begun its run as a fairly conventional nationalist publication, started printing debates about economic systems, the nature of democracy, and the question of what post-war Germany might look like. The editors were carefully selected anti-Nazi prisoners who had been brought forward by the Special Projects program, but their audience was growing receptive, not because of persuasion but because of observation. One prisoner, Lieutenant Herman G., whose last name was redacted from the letter that passed through American censors, wrote home in the late fall of 1943 in terms that would have shocked him 6 months earlier. He wrote that he had been told America was weak, divided, and incapable. He wrote that every day he spent in America, he saw the opposite. He described it as the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth, and noted, with what appears to be genuine anguish in the original letter, that they had been told fairy tales by criminals. Christmas 1943 delivered the blow that even the most psychologically resilient prisoners struggled to absorb. American church groups, civic organizations, and ordinary citizens sent more than 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners who had been months earlier trying to kill American soldiers. The packages contained cigarettes, candy, soap, games, and handwritten cards. Local communities near camps organized deliveries of homemade food. At Camp Herne, the local Methodist church choir came to the camp fence and performed German Christmas carols for the prisoners. Women from the town of Herne sent in cookies and cakes. The Boy Scouts hand-delivered Christmas cards. Oberleutnant Walter Mueller, who had lost his brother in the Allied bombing of Hamburg that summer, wrote about this in a letter that historians have cited many times since. He wrote that these Americans knew perfectly well who the prisoners were. Many of them had sons and husbands fighting and dying against German forces at that exact moment. He wrote that they showed genuine Christian kindness anyway. He wrote the question that many of the prisoners were arriving at simultaneously, which was what kind of people treated their enemies this way. He concluded that there was only one answer: people who were absolutely certain of their own power and absolutely secure in it. Only people who knew without any doubt that they had already won could afford to be this generous. The Christmas dinner served in the camps that year: turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, vegetables, pies, and ice cream, produced a document that has become one of the most quoted sources in the historical literature on this subject. A Feldwebel identified only as Hansa wrote to his family a short time later and told them about the meal. He wrote that they ate like kings. Better than German generals, he said, better than party leaders. And when he asked the guards if this was a special occasion, they told him it was a normal American Christmas dinner and that every family in the country was eating the same meal that day. Hansa wrote that he sat with this fact for a long time after the meal was over. He wrote, "If they can feed prisoners like this, what must their own soldiers eat?" By the spring of 1944, with more than 40,000 German prisoners enrolled in formal educational programs, the re-education effort was shifting into a higher register. The University of Chicago provided correspondence courses. Stanford University and other institutions sent professors directly to the larger camps to lecture on democracy, economics, and American history. Prisoners who had been told that Americans were cultural barbarians were discovering libraries stocked with millions of books, universities that genuinely welcomed students from all social classes, and scientific research that was, in many fields, years ahead of anything Germany had achieved. The camp theatres showed Hollywood films, not propaganda but regular commercial releases. Prisoners watched Gone with the Wind and were confronted with a portrait of American defeat and eventual recovery that resonated uncomfortably with their own position. They watched The Grapes of Wrath and were startled by the film's willingness to show American poverty, failure, and injustice on screen without apparent embarrassment. Lieutenant Joseph Kramer, a schoolteacher from Stuttgart before the war, wrote that they hide nothing. They show their failures, their conflicts, their shameful history. He wrote that this honesty seemed to make them stronger rather than weaker, and that he had spent a long time trying to understand how that could be true, and what it said about a society where such self-criticism was considered patriotic rather than treasonous. Walter Holstein, who before the war had been a distinguished professor of private and commercial law at the University of Frankfurt, was captured in 1944 and assigned to one of the American camps. He did something that has since become a notable footnote in European history. He organized a camp university. He gathered prisoners with professional and academic qualifications and established a structured educational program for their fellow captives, covering law, economics, languages, and science. American authorities encouraged it. Holstein would survive the war, return to Germany, become rector of the University of Frankfurt, and eventually serve as the first president of the European Commission, the governing body of the early European Economic Community. He would later say that his experience of American democracy during captivity, its assumptions, its practices, and its confidence, was foundational to his thinking about what Europe needed to become. The event that produced what many prisoners described as the final, total collapse of any remaining ideological certainty was not in the camps at all. It was on a newsreel screen inside a camp theatre on a June evening in 1944. The prisoners at Camp Shelby in Mississippi watched footage of the Normandy invasion. They saw 6,000 ships. They saw 11,000 aircraft flying in organized waves over a coast that was recognizably French. They saw 150,000 men landing on beaches in a single day. They saw the artificial harbors, the mulberry constructions that the Allies had built and towed across the Channel, that were already receiving 15,000 tons of supplies per day over open water. One prisoner, Friedrich von Troben, wrote the line that has been cited by more historians than perhaps any other document from this period. He wrote, "We knew then that it was not just the war that was lost, but the entire project. We had challenged the greatest industrial power in the world with fairy tales about racial superiority. We had sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their automatic weapons, and personal courage against unlimited resources. The summer harvest work of 1944 added the agricultural dimension to what the prisoners had already absorbed about manufacturing and logistics. In Kansas, prisoners working the wheat fields watched single farms produce more grain than entire German provinces. The combine harvesters moved across the plains in formations that covered hundreds of acres in a day. The grain elevators along the rail lines could hold more wheat than Germany imported in an average year. In California's Central Valley, prisoners picking fruit watched as perfectly edible oranges and peaches were ploughed under in enormous quantities. The explanation given was that there was simply too much, and that prices had to be protected. Gefreiter Otto Schultz wrote that mountains of oranges were being bulldozed into pits because there were too many. He wrote that the prisoners begged to be allowed to box them up and send them to Germany. The guards were sympathetic, he wrote. They explained it was impossible. But their sympathy was real. They genuinely could not conceive of a world where this situation, too much food to use, was a problem rather than an abundance. The concentration camp footage shown to prisoners in April 1945, as American forces liberated the installations at Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen, produced a final, different kind of collapse. The prisoners who had maintained their national pride through military defeat, who had told themselves that they were soldiers who had fought honorably for Germany even if the war had gone wrong, were now confronted with evidence that the state they had served was not merely defeated but evil. Many of the initial reactions were denial. The footage was propaganda, some prisoners said. The scenes were staged, the prisoners shown were actors. But letters from Germany began arriving in the same weeks confirming that the footage was real. One prisoner who had maintained one of the most detailed diaries throughout his captivity wrote that they had believed they were warriors for a great cause. They had discovered they were instruments of criminals. They had believed they were bringing civilization to inferior peoples. They had found that they were the barbarians. He wrote that the Americans they had called weak and decadent had turned out to be the ones who understood what civilization actually meant. When the war ended in May 1945, the 371,683 German prisoners in American custody began the process of repatriation. It was not a simple or quick process. Many prisoners were first sent to help with reconstruction work in France and Britain before being finally returned to Germany, and the last did not leave until well into 1946. But before they left, American authorities provided them with something else. Vocational training, agricultural education, courses in constitutional law and democratic theory. The prisoners were given practical skills and conceptual frameworks for rebuilding a destroyed country. Some of them knew about the Marshall Plan before it had been publicly announced. Many of them had the distinct sense, confirmed by explicit conversations with American officers, that America intended to rebuild Germany rather than punish it. One prisoner wrote that this generosity from the victors was entirely incomprehensible to minds that had been shaped by the way Germany itself had treated the peoples it conquered. They returned to a Germany that was divided, bombed to rubble, and in the grip of a famine. They had been gaining weight in Texas and Nebraska while their families were losing it in Hamburg and Munich. T. Hay brought home their final Red Cross packages, chocolate and coffee and canned goods that became family treasures in households where such things had not been seen in years. Their children, who'd grown up hearing stories about America that sounded fantastic, would in many cases spend the next decade watching the stories confirmed as the occupation brought American goods, American culture, and eventually American capital into West Germany. The numbers recorded by American military authorities when all was done are striking on their own terms. Of 371,683 German prisoners held in America, only 2,222 ever attempted escape, and of those none succeeded in escaping permanently. Most were caught within 24 hours. Post-war surveys showed that 95% of prisoners rated their treatment as good or excellent. 74% reported that their captivity had positively changed their worldview. 61% expressed genuine interest in learning more about democracy. Less than 10% maintained strong National Socialist beliefs by the time they were repatriated. Walter Hallstein became president of the European Commission. Hans Kroll, a prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West Germany's ambassador to the United States and later to the Soviet Union. Rüdiger von Manteuffel, held at Camp Herne, served as West Germany's permanent representative to the United Nations. Edward Ackermann, who had been a prisoner at Fort Robinson, became a leading figure in German agricultural reform in the 1950s. These men brought what they had seen in America back to Germany in the form of specific knowledge, specific techniques, and a specific conviction that the model they had witnessed of democratic governance underpinning industrial productivity, underpinning a broadly shared prosperity, was one that worked, was reproducible, and was what Germany needed to become. The economic miracle of the 1950s, the Wirtschaftswunder that transformed West Germany from rubble to one of the world's leading industrial economies in less than a decade, was built on many things: American capital through the Marshall Plan, German engineering traditions, political stability under Konrad Adenauer. But it was also built, in ways that are harder to quantify but no less real, on the knowledge that roughly 400,000 German men had carried home in their heads and their memories. Knowledge of how a society looked and functioned when it was genuinely free, genuinely productive, and genuinely confident in its own abundance. They had seen it from the windows of Pullman cars rolling through the Virginia night. They had seen it in the parking lots of factories in Detroit and the rubber plants of Louisville. They'd seen it in the grain barges on the Mississippi and the combine harvesters moving across the plains of Kansas. They'd seen it in the faces of the farmers and the workers and the church choir members who brought cookies to enemy soldiers at Christmas. Dr. Arnold Kramer, the historian at Texas A&M University who spent decades as the definitive scholarly authority on the German prisoner experience in America, concluded that the program succeeded precisely because it was not really a program at all. It succeeded because the reality of American life was more powerful than any argument about it could have been. Every hot meal in the mess hall was evidence. Every night shift running in a factory across a dark American valley was evidence. Every farmer who sat down with a prisoner at a lunch break and shared food without making anything of it was evidence. You cannot argue someone out of an ideology with better arguments alone, but you can confront them with a reality so different from what they were told that the ideology simply has no place left to stand. The men who arrived in Mexia, Texas, in June 1943 had marched down Railroad Street in the summer heat as confirmed believers in German superiority and American weakness. The men who boarded ships home in 1946 were something else. They were witnesses. Witnesses to what a free society looked like at the height of its power, and witnesses to what it meant that they had been sent to fight it. Some of them never fully recovered from what they had learned. Some of them spent the rest of their lives trying to build, in the ruins of the country they came from, something that looked like what they had seen from the window of a train crossing Tennessee in the dark. And some of them, against all expectation, actually succeeded.